time for the first monthly wrap-up of 2024. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Emily. Today I'm going to go through the wrap-up of the books that I read in January. So since this is the first wrap-up of 2024, I'm going to try to format these as similarly as possible throughout the year. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible while still giving my thoughts on the books that I read and not giving spoilers. So we'll just see how this one goes, and I can make changes as the year goes on if I need to. So first, some stats for the month. I completed 19 books. I had one DNF, not counted within those 19. I read 7,377 pages. 3 books were read on my Kindle, 2 from the library, 1 from Kindle Unlimited, and then 16 books were read physically. And my overall average rating for the month was 3.6. I read 6 fantasy books, 5 romance books, 6 thriller books, 1 contemporary fiction, and 1 nonfiction. So I've been tracking my books that I've bought and received. I'm trying not to buy any books right now, so the only book I technically purchased was my book of the month, which was The Fury. And my birthday was this past month as well, so I did receive Ruthless Vows as a present for that. I do not count audiobooks as a completed book on my Goodreads challenge, but I do like to track the ones that I've listened to just so that I remember. And this month I listened to 5 audiobooks. Done and Dusted by Lila Sage was the first one. The Off Limits Rule and the Temporary Roomie by Sarah Adams. And then Mile High and The Right Move, which were by Liz Chalmford. So on to the books I read. I will start with the DNF that I had. It was Heartless by Marissa Myers. I got this on Kindle Unlimited, so it's not like which is why I think it was easier for me to DNF. But I just couldn't get into this book. I gave it 50%. I literally read to the 50% mark, and I questioned why I was forcing myself to read a book that I was not interested in. I felt like it was a chore. I wasn't enjoying myself. So I'm not going to waste my time reading a book I'm not enjoying when there's so many other books that I want to read. It does have decent reviews on Goodreads, so give it a try if it's something that sounds interesting to you. But it's basically a Queen of Hearts origin story, I guess is the best way to say that. I don't know how it ends, obviously, but you could tell where it was leading to. It was set in Wonderland. You had your White Rabbit, you had the King of Hearts. It took place in Hearts in Wonderland. You had the Mad Tea Party was in there, but the characters were a little bit different. If you're familiar with Alice in Wonderland, it was all very throwback to the original. So your main characters are Catherine, who I assume will become the Queen of Hearts, and then Jester is your main male character. They call him Jest, and he is introduced as the new Jester for the King's Court, and that is who she is romantically attracted to. However, the king wants to propose to her, and she just doesn't have feelings for him like that. He is considerably older than her, so it is kind of weird. I don't think I would have liked how it ended if it went into the realm of what actually happens with the Queen of Hearts anyway, so about halfway through I just gave up. So now I'm going to go through the books pretty much in the order that I read them this month. Started the year off with Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. I gave this book 5 stars. It's my only 5-star of the month. And it's about a 4 on my spice level. Spice level is subjective. Ratings are subjective, so obviously go into them with your own thoughts. This is obviously the sequel to Fourth Wing. It picks up exactly where that book ends. Your main characters are still Violet Sorrengail and Xaden Rorson. I can't really talk too much about what happens in this, obviously, if you haven't read Fourth Wing. The premise of that is it takes place at a war college, and Violet and Xaden are dragon riders, and the first book is her first year in the 3-year war college, his final year in it. There's a love story between them. There is an underlying war that's going on, and a lot of stuff comes out at the end of the first book about what is exactly going on and what's being hidden from them. And this book picks up where that left off. This was a lot more fantasy and less romance, which I don't think a lot of people liked. I liked it. We didn't get a lot of world building in the first book, and I think that this really explained a lot of things better. I talked a little bit about this in my book haul video because this was a book that I got for Christmas, and I'd already read it by the time I did the book haul video, but I saw a lot of negative reviews on this book, which just proves to me that you can never go into a book with other people's impressions in mind. You have to make your own. Everyone is subjected to their own opinion and how they're going to take a book. I know a lot of people were upset with Violet and how she acted in this book, but I think a lot of people forget that she is only 19. She is not the most emotionally mature person. Nobody's really emotionally mature at the age of 19, and I think Xaden's maybe 20, 23. So you have to understand their age, and I think people forget that because of the content in this book. And there are 3 more books after this. I didn't expect a happy ending to this one. There has to be conflict. There has to be things that keep the story going. And I thought that this was a great second installment of this Empyrean series. So I'm looking forward to the rest of them. I wouldn't say put this to not read this. If you've seen negative reviews, give it your own, try your own opinion. The next book I read was Remotely Loved by Lori Thorne. I got this book in a romance reveal box, and I really enjoyed it. It is an indie author book. Obviously, a lot of those books are, for the most part, not all of them that I receive in there are like indie published books. This is actually part of a series. I don't think I'll go out of my way to get the second one, but this was really cute. Our main characters are Hazel and Sam, and they meet via work during the pandemic when everything is remote. And they do kind of fall in love over talking to each other on Teams and working together and having conference calls and individual like video calls with each other. They do develop feelings for each other. I wouldn't say fall in love, but they develop feelings for each other. And this book is about them coming to terms with that and understanding what they actually feel for each other when they meet in person for the first time at a conference. So it's cute. Typical little love story. I don't really know much to say about it. It was enjoyable. It was not my favorite romance I've ever read. I gave it a 3-star and a 2.5 spice because there is a little bit of spice towards the end. But it was cute. It was interesting to read a book that took place during the pandemic and has that kind of atmosphere to it and what the working world has really become. As someone who worked in person throughout the entire pandemic due to what my job was. While I am in office, I work in a facility that was considered essential, and my job was considered essential to being in the facility. So I didn't get this full experience. I didn't get the work from home, but I did get a lot of the everything's done on Teams now, everything's done virtually now, even the pandemic being over. This is still a lot of what we see in the workforce. So that was kind of an interesting take, I think, on a modern day romance. Next was another KU book, and it was The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. I'd been looking forward to reading this book for a while. I'd heard a lot of good things about it, knew the premise of it, but didn't want to know too much because I didn't want it to be ruined for me. Our main characters are Theo, who is our narrator, and then Alicia, who is the silent patient. So this book is essentially about a woman who kills her husband and then just stops talking. And then Theo is her psychologist, psychiatrist, I'm not sure which one he's technically considered, that's working with her throughout her time in the facility that she's in now after being accused of the murder. His goal, he came to this facility to try to get her to talk, to figure out what happened. And I can't obviously talk too much about what is unveiled because that would give away the ending, but I didn't really see it coming, where he was going with the story. You learn a lot about her life prior to the murder and little things, like little Easter eggs and stuff that she put, and she was is an artist, so there was little Easter eggs and stuff that she put into her paintings, and her relationships with, like, not only her husband, but also her art director, the guy that owns the studio that she would put her pieces in to sell. I think that's what you call them. The whole time you're kind of like, is this guy a reliable narrator? Is what she's saying true? Because there is a lot of back and forth. And the ending was shocking, and I really enjoyed the story. So I gave it a 4-star, 0 spice, definitely a good thriller, very fast paced. I read it really quickly. Next up was Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. This is the first book in the Maple Hill series. Our 2 main characters in this are Anastasia, who is the ice skater, and Nathan, who is the hockey player. The premise of this book is that they share the arena at their college, but there's 2 separate rinks there, and something happens to the first rink at the beginning of the story that they cannot be used, so they have to learn to share it. Anastasia is training to be in the Olympics with her pairs partner, and then obviously Nathan's trying to practice for games and stuff with his team. He's the captain of the hockey team. So they have to kind of figure out how to work together, and that drives their relationship from strangers to enemies to friends to lovers. I think there's a lot of good representation in this book of some mental health things maybe that aren't truly talked about too much in books. And the relationship felt very mature in this one. There was miscommunication, but I felt like they handled it in a very adult manner. It is a college romance, so they should be a little bit more emotionally mature. But I've obviously read adult romances where these people are my age in their 30s and don't know how to talk to each other. So I do think Hannah wrote two very emotionally mature characters for this to handle the miscommunication better than I've ever seen it. I gave this a 4-star as well as a 4 spice rating because it was a pretty spicy book, but didn't really take away from the story, I don't think. Next, I read City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. This is technically a reread for me. I did read the entire Mortal Instrument series years ago, but one of my goals for this year is to read all of Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunter universe, so I started with the Mortal Instruments as she recommends. I did remember a lot of the stuff from this book, not as much as some of the details I didn't remember, but the overall storyline I did remember, oh, they're going to go here next, this is going to happen. So it was a pretty quick reread. I gave this 3.5 stars and half a spice rating. There's just a little bit in here, it's nothing extreme. I don't think this hit as significant as it did when I was younger, but I still did enjoy the story. I like being back with these characters, and I'm excited to see what adding the other parts of the universe does to me going back through these books. So, a great start to that, and I still have many, many more books to go in this universe this year, but I did want to get a start on it in January. Next was The Grace Year by Kim Liggett. I saw this going around on BookTube a little bit last year, and I picked this up when I found it at a discount store for a few dollars, and it was probably one of the best discount books I've ever read. This story is a little bit, I want to say a little bit like Handmaid's Tale, but also a little I think I've seen Lord of the Flies compared to it, because they do send these girls when they hit a certain age out into the woods to release their powers into the wild because they are they seduce men too much and whatever when they have their magic. The fact that I compared it to The Handmaid's Tale should tell you everything you need to know about the premise of this book if you've read The Handmaid's Tale. So it is a very infuriating and empowering book at the same time. It is about women fighting for equality and trying to figure out why men are telling them this about themselves when they're not really understanding everything, and they're questioning, do I have magic? Does this need to happen? And there's a lot of psychosis and stuff that goes on, and there's these men that sit out in the woods and try to poach these women if they exit the little camp that they're sent to sell their parts for magical reasons. It's disgusting, but the overall storyline was phenomenal. I could not put this book down. I read it in one sitting. Highly recommend if you think you can stomach some of the harsher parts of this book. There's probably trigger warnings. I didn't look any up, but I would maybe look up to see if there's any if you're scared before reading this, but it, I believe, is a YA book. There is a little spice, half a spice again. It's implied more than it's actually talked about. Definitely one of the most powerful reads as a female for me since probably The Handmaid's Tale. So I give this 4.5 stars. It was so close to being a 5-star for me, but there were a few things that I didn't like. I don't want to go too much into detail with that because it gives away parts of the story, but it was so close. So close. So 4.5 stars, again, half a spice rating, but I would kind of look up the premise of this before reading it if you think that you'd be bothered by any of the content that could possibly be in this book. Our main character in this book is Tierney. She is the female that we follow throughout this. And then there's 2 male, I'd say, main characters. Riker is the more main male character, but then Michael is also a big part of the book as well. Next, I read The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. This book is about Olive and her twin sister, whose name I cannot remember, and then her sister's fiance, then husband, Dane, and his brother Ethan, who is the best man at their wedding. Olive is the maid of honor, and her and Ethan do not get along, have never gotten along in any times that they've ever met prior to the wedding, so they both kind of don't like each other. Throughout the beginning of the book, Olive talks about how lucky her sister is, that she wins everything all the time, and she's always been the lucky one, and Olive's always had the bad luck. But then her sister won her wedding location, won the food and everything, and it was a seafood buffet. And Olive can't eat seafood, and Ethan is a germaphobe and will not eat off of a buffet. So they both get plated meals. Everybody else at the wedding that eats from the buffet gets sick. So she is offered her sister's honeymoon that she won that is non-refundable, can't be transferred. But since they're twins, she thinks they can pull it off. And all it said was her sister and guest. So Ethan goes with her. So the premise of this is obviously enemies to lovers, or rivals to lovers. I don't really know if they'd be considered enemies, really. You find out a lot about why they didn't like each other and assumptions that were made about things that happened when they met before, that the other was like, well, this happened, so I assumed you hated me, and they're like, no, this is why I did that. A lot of, I don't want to say miscommunication because they weren't really in contact with each other, but just misrepresentation of what was actually happening when they met prior. Olive gets a new job at the beginning of the book and ends up running into the boss of the company that she's going to be working for down there, so they just have to keep like appropriating a lie because she can't say that she's not married to Ethan because the hotel finds out, they'll have to pay for it, and so she has to lie to her boss. Like, it's just a bunch of lies building and building and building on themselves, and there is some stuff towards the end of the book with some other characters that is even more lies compounded on other things. So overall, it was an interesting story. Not my favorite Christina Lauren book I've ever read. There was a lot of mess, a lot of drama, and not in a way that was really enjoyable to me. So this was just pure 3-star for me, which is pretty average for me on a romance novel, and it was only 1 spice rating. Not 2. Again, more implied than spelled out. I mean, some of it was, but not like a lot of the other books I've read. So low on my spice scale. Next, I read Shadow and Bone, which is the first in the Shadow and Bone trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. This follows Alina and her discovering powers that she has that she wasn't aware of when she was born. This is a lot of world building, a lot of explaining. This is a lot of explaining like the difference between a Grisha and then there's like a normal person and the different parts of the kingdom. And the Darkling is like the head of all the Grishas, the most powerful Grisha, and her working with him and trying to figure out how to save the kingdom from, there's like this dark shadow area, the Shadowfold, just look at the back of the book, that no one can really cross through safely because there's these like beasts inside that if they hear or see movement, because they can see in it, I guess they can hear, but if they like sense movement or anything, they attack. So most people that try to make it through die. The beginning of the book starts off with Alina and her childhood friend Mal, who she grew up with at an orphanage, and they're part of this group that's trying to pass through the Shadowfold safely. During this, Mal gets attacked and Alina's powers just manifest while she's trying to save him. And then she gets the attention of the Darkling because she's got a power that nobody's seen and could be very helpful in eliminating the Shadowfold, or at least helping people pass safely through it. From there, she's taken away from Mal, and they kind of live separate lives for the beginning of this book until you kind of learn a little bit more about what's actually going on in the world. I don't really want to go into too much more detail because it'll ruin what happens in this book as well as the future books, but that's the premise of Shadow and Bone, is Alina coming into her powers and figuring out who's good and who's evil and what's actually going on. I gave this book 4 stars and spice level of 1.5. And then I loved this book so much that I didn't immediately go into, but I did read the other 2 books in the trilogy, Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising. Follows the same characters. I can't go into more detail because it's part of the series, but I also gave Siege and Storm a 4-star, and it is a 1-star spice. And then Ruin and Rising, I gave all 4 of them a 4, I guess. Ruin and Rising, again, was a 4-star, and it was only like a half on the spice scale. As you move more through these books, it does become a little bit higher stakes. The one thing I will have to say about Siege and Storm is that I felt like it dragged a little bit in the middle, and then it could have ended before a conflict happened in this. I felt like the conflict at the end was rushed and probably could have just been put into the 3rd book. But other than that, I really enjoyed these books. Not a 5-star read for me by any means, but still very enjoyable. And I do have Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom that I can go into now that are like the next part of the series. It's a duology, and then I think there's also another duology that comes after those. I enjoyed my trek into the Grishaverse, my first trek into the Grishaverse, and I'm hoping I enjoy the rest of them as well. The next book I read was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This I got from the library, from the Libby app on my Kindle, and it is the contemporary fiction book that I read this month. I think this was one of the highest rated books of last year, so I was really interested in reading it. I heard the story was great, compelling, all these wonderful things. I was wildly uncomfortable reading this book. I don't really know why, but the premise of this is these 2 girls that knew each other in college that were both like writing majors. You have June, who's your main female character and your narrator, and then Athena, who is the other author, writer, that is a big part of this story. Athena went out of school and became extremely popular, extremely successful, is living the life that June has always wanted. Athena is of Asian descent, I believe Chinese descent, and a lot of her books center around those kinds of customs. In some way, shape, or form, that culture is represented in her books. And then June is just like a Caucasian female. June and Athena are hanging out one night after Athena signed a deal for I think like a Netflix series or something for one of her books. I can't remember exactly what it was. And they go back to Athena's apartment and they're hanging out, and Athena tragically dies that night in front of June. So while they're at the apartment, June sees Athena's next manuscript sitting on her desk in her office and steals it because it's written on a typewriter, so there's no like digital copy anywhere for anybody to prove that she didn't write it. And in her mind convinces herself that it's okay to publish the book because it's Athena's last story and it needs to be told. But she obviously publishes it under her name, and she does not give Athena the credit that is due. So the whole premise of this book is understanding the publishing industry and how hard it is for authors to get a book accepted, and after they have one good book, coming up with another one and continuing to improve, and all the little backhanded things and the cultural appropriation and stuff that happens. And obviously June is accused of that because she published a book that talks about Chinese historical culture, and I don't know, there was just something about this book that made me very uncomfortable, and I think it was the fact that June was just lying this whole time, and you're in her head, and she's trying to convince herself that what she's doing is right, and you're just like, but it's not. For me, it was uncomfortable. I ended up giving this 3 stars just because I couldn't shake that weird feeling that I read the whole time. It was not a bad book. It was very interesting. It was very different, but I didn't like the feeling that I had while I was reading it, which is why it was only 3 stars for me. 0 spice in this book. The next book I read was Robin Cook's Pandemic. If you want my full insight on this book, I did do a reading vlog that included this one. I did not really enjoy this book. I did not realize, and I should have, that Robin Cook is actually a doctor. He's an MD, and his thrillers, which is what this is, are medical thrillers, and they're very detailed, and there's a lot of stuff to me that was unnecessary that kind of was just like harder to read because it was a lot of medical jargon and a lot of stuff that I understood, but it just felt like it made the story drag on a little bit. We have Jack and Laurie Stapleton in this book. They have a whole series of books by him. I did not realize that. This is like the 11th one in that. It didn't take away from anything. Like, they still explained their background and their relationship and everything well enough that I was able to slide right into this story. But it's called Pandemic. I'm not sure that was the most appropriate term for what happened in this book, but basically there's a perceived outbreak of possibly like the next flu strain that could be as bad as like the flu of, what was that, like 1912 or something? I don't remember. There's a mysterious death on the subway. They can't figure out what caused it, and then there's more deaths that follow after that have the same symptoms. And the beginning of the book starts off with this guy of Chinese descent. Again, that must have been yellow books that have that in them, must have been my thing this month. Going to his dad's clinic in Delaware or New Jersey, and like you can tell he doesn't want to be there, and he's not agreeing with what his dad is doing, which is a lot of like gene manipulation and stuff like that. So that part is how you get like a little bit of insight into that at the beginning of the book, and then it does tie in at the end about the son's thoughts and what his dad is doing, not only medically but also what he feels like he's doing to betray their home country of China. So that does play into it a lot. It doesn't seem like it's going to at first, but it does come back, so there is a reason for it starting out the way it does. There's also a lot of Laurie and Jack's relationship in this because they are both medical examiners, but she was made the chief medical examiner, so there's the balance there from him not really wanting to play by the rules. He wants to do things on his own terms, and her being like, you can't do that. I'm going to get in trouble. I just can't turn a blind eye to it. So it was not bad. I gave this 2.5 stars. Again, 0 spice, but it just wasn't something that I would recommend to people that read books that I typically enjoy, and that's why I couldn't give it a 3. But overall, the story wasn't bad. It was still interesting, but I don't think I would recommend it to people that I know that read books similarly to me. Next was Best Fake Fiancé by Roxy Noir. This was also a book that I got in my romance reveal box. So again, an indie published book. You can tell because it's not floppy at all. But this is also part of a series of the Loveless Brothers series. I can't remember how many brothers there were. I read a lot of books this month that had like brothers. But there were quite a few brothers in this. And their banter was great. It was probably my favorite part of the book. The premise is that we have Charlie and we have Daniel. And they've been best friends since childhood. Daniel gets himself into a situation in his early 20s where he accidentally gets a woman pregnant, does not end up actually having a relationship with this woman. It was just a bunch of one-night stands went wrong. And he ends up getting full custody of his daughter when he finds out about her because the mother is into things that are like drugs. I think it was drugs or drinking or something, and she basically gets the kid taken away from her, and the daughter ends up on Daniel's door. The beginning of the book opens with what we think is just going to be a custody hearing to give the mother more privileges, but it ends up being that she challenges him for full custody. So because she's now in a stable relationship and all of this, she wants their daughter full time, and she wants to move to a different state with her new husband. So Daniel panics. He's like, I'm in a relationship too, and he throws Charlie's name out. So then he has to convince her to fake be engaged to him, and I think we all know where that goes. So I'm not really a big single dad trope fan. This wasn't too bad. I didn't love the daughter in this, but I really did enjoy the family dynamic and the brother dynamic. I also didn't love how Daniel talked about Charlie and how he didn't think she was responsible, and she didn't think about anybody but herself, and there was a lot of miscommunication, and a lot of just like, he was just kind of mean at times, and I didn't love that. So this one was just a 3-star for me, and the spice was about 3.5. That also kind of went like 0 to 100, but a lot of romance novels do that. Still a cute book. I would be interested in reading some of the other books about some of the brothers. I think this was the second one because there is a brother already in a relationship in this one. But some of the like younger brothers, I really did like their personality, and I'd be possibly interested in reading one of theirs. But Daniel was not my favorite male love interest. Let's just put it that way. Up next, I read The Fury, also by Alex Michaelides. This was my second book by him this month. This was my book of the month for this month. And it's about a movie star who invites her friends to this Greek island that her first husband bought her. So we have, I can't remember all of their names. Again, this was in the reading vlog that I did. But Elliot Chase is our narrator. And he's like one of her friends, but also like a writer for Broadway. So this takes place in England. Well, their home is England. And they're in an island off of Mykonos in Greece. So she takes her new husband, her son, who's like a teenager, I think he's about to be 18, her best friend, who is also an actress, but she's like a Broadway actress in the London scene, Elliot, who is a friend that she met early on in her time when she moved from America to London, and her, I don't know what to call her exactly, like her assistant slash housekeeper slash, I don't really know what to call her, but she found her the first time that she went to this Greek island, and then just kind of took her home with her and was like, I want you to be my assistant. And then there's also a guy, I think his name was Nico or something, that lives on the island and takes care of the house when nobody else is there. This book the ending reminded me a lot of The Last Word by Taylor Adams. There was a lot of whiplash there. You thought you knew it was happening, but you didn't. And the whole book was kind of like that because Elliot was a very unreliable narrator. He kind of tells you that at the beginning too, that this is my opinion of what happened, and some of the thoughts you're going to wonder how I know that, but it's just what I've deduced based on conversations that happened over the course of this trip. But he goes back a lot on what he says. He'll tell a story, and then he's like, but this is actually what happened. And then the next part is what actually happened. And then it's like, but nope, this is that. There was just a lot of, I wasn't exactly sure 100% what was going on all the time. I still really enjoyed this book. It did not hit the same as Taylor Adams for me, but it was, again, another quick read and interesting and very twisty and turny at the end. I still don't know that I'm 100% sure what exactly happened. So I gave this one 3.5 stars because I was confused a lot throughout it. but it was still a very interesting way to tell a story. There was no spice in this either. I think I liked The Silent Patient better, but I would not say don't read this. I did still enjoy this book. You just really have to pay attention to what's happening. Next was one of my most anticipated reads for the year, and that was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the second book in the Letters of Enchantment duology. The first book was Divine Rivals. We still have our two main characters, Iris and Roman, and this book picks up exactly where the first book left off. This was a lot more, again, I feel like I said the same thing for Iron Flame and Fourth Wing. This was more fantasy, less romance. So in the first book, you learn about the War of the Two Gods, but you don't know much about it. You just know that it's happening, and it's the premise of the background of the story, but it's focused mainly on Iris and Roman's romance. This is a lot. This is all the war. There's the undertone of romance, but this is more about the war and what's actually going on and who the gods are. And it was interesting because it was almost like an urban god fantasy, because the world they live in is relatively urban, and the gods kind of walk among the people like human people, and unless you really know who you're talking to, you don't know that it's them. It was fascinating. Rebecca Ross writes so beautifully. This book was beautifully written, so lyrically written. The romance between Roman and Iris was just as beautiful in this book as it was in the first one, and I think it was even deeper, and there was just a lot more character development. Different characters were brought into this one. You still had your main characters from the first book that did carry into this one. As people, I think you just saw them grow up so quickly in zero time, because again, it picks up right where the first one left off, but the maturity level changes because of what happens to them. And I loved the ending. I think it was a wonderful conclusion to this, and I'm happy it was just 2 books. I think everything that needed to happen happened in these 2 books. I did think that the ending was rushed. It reminded me a lot of Game of Thrones. If you've not watched Game of Thrones to its conclusion and do not want to know what I'm talking about, fast forward like 30 seconds. But in the final season, in all 7 seasons, there's this build up to the Night King dying, and then all of a sudden it's just like the most anticlimactic killing of him. And that's kind of what it felt like in here. They built up and built up and built up to this conflict, and then it was over in like a page. So that was the only downfall to this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. It again was so close to being a 5-star read, but I just felt like there was so much build up to such a anticlimactic, oh, that's over. Like, it's just what it felt like. So still recommend the details and what you find out about the war and the gods and their relationships and the relationships of other people and where they stand in this war is just, it's fascinating and well done. So I really enjoyed this book. The spice level in this was also like 0.5. Pretty much non-existent, but again, implied, so I have to give it more than a 0. Next, I read Britney Spears' memoir, The Woman in Me. I got this through Libby as well from my library, and this was a quick read. It wasn't very long. I don't rate nonfictions. I grew up, obviously, idolizing Britney Spears. She was extremely popular when I was a child and all through my life. She's older than me, but still, like, she was popular when I was at the right age for that. I remember all these twists and turns and the stuff that she talks about with the different parts of her career and everything, and it was interesting to hear her side of the story. A lot of times in the book, though, it definitely felt like it was written in her voice. So I can't say it was the most professionally written book. You could tell that it was definitely her. It felt like you were reading a diary or like an inner monologue in her mind. And there were times where I was just like heartbroken about the stuff that she went through. But then there were times that I felt like she was trying to justify her actions and not only trying to convince the audience of what happened, but I feel like at times she was trying to convince herself that's what really happened. It was interesting to get her input on it, but I also know that she's come out since then and kind of been regretful for how she has portrayed some of the people in the book, so that's why I'm just not sure exactly how much stock to put in what her story was, but I felt like she needed to feel like she got her words out there, and she did that, and it was still very enlightening, and I know she went through a lot of hard things, and I think she needed help from a very young age, and it just was ignored and not given to her, and there was a lot that came from that, so that's my takeaway from it. Then I read No One Can Know by Kate Alice Marshall. This was my December book of the month. This follows 3 sisters, Emma, Daphne, and Juliet, who goes by JJ. And essentially what happens is their parents are murdered in their house when they're all very young. And throughout the book, it changes the different POVs from the three sisters, from what happened in the past as well as like what's going on in the future. The present. Emma and her husband Nate fell on hard times, so they have to move back into the house that the murder happened in, that the three sisters still own because they just never wanted to do anything with it. They're essentially estranged from each other too. They still have contact, but barely any. So Emma tells them that she's coming back and needs to live in the house, and the other sisters end up coming back to town too because they're afraid of what she's going to find out. And what we learn is that, like, Emma took the brunt of most of the blame when they were kids, and that's why she had to move away because everybody thought she did it. But you learn quickly that Emma didn't. Like, they just nobody really knew what happened, so they were like, okay, this is what we're going to tell the police. So throughout the book, more and more and more comes out about what actually happened, what memories maybe are being suppressed, things that were going on with their parents that they weren't aware of, as well as each other that they weren't aware of, and other people in town that were entwined in it. I enjoyed this book a lot. I didn't really see where it was going in the end, and it's another one that still has you going, okay, what exactly happened? Even though there's a conclusion at the end, it's kind of, I think she intentionally I think Alice Marshall kind of intentionally leaves it a little bit with a little bit of ambiguity there for you to be like, but what exactly happened? So it was an interesting end. I definitely think that the ending was fascinating. So I recommend this one for sure. It was a 3.5, but a very high 3.5 for me. This is my second book by this author, and I've enjoyed them both, so highly recommend. I don't know if she has any other books out, but this and What Lies in the Woods was the other book I read by her. Both very good. Next was another book from my romance reveal box. Again, you can tell, indie published. I think this is also part of a series. Our two main characters in this are Georgia and Beau. They were childhood frenemies because their families didn't get along, but they were friends, and then they both had feelings for each other and then couldn't be together, and there's a lot going on that like the other doesn't know about, and messy. Georgia ends up leaving abruptly when they graduate high school, and then comes back 10 years later because of certain circumstances of people that are no longer around, that she feels now safe that she can come back to the town. And Beau doesn't really forgive her for leaving him and his brothers high and dry and not explaining why she left and not saying goodbye. In this book, there was very little plot to this book, and I say that knowing it's a romance book, but a lot of the beginning of the book was you find out that she's back in town and he doesn't forgive her, and then it jumps straight back to their childhood and takes you up to when she left, and then it jumps back to present time. And pretty much when it jumps back to present time, their conflict is resolved very quickly. So there's also a little bit of like a crime underlying storyline to this that was kind of unnecessary, but I guess made it more suspenseful. Kind of all over the place. It was cute. It was a 3 for me again. 3-star, 3 spice rating, because it was very spicy once it was like the end of the book was just full smut. It's a romance novel. I mean, look at the front. You know it's going to be just like a romance smutty novel, but it was a nice break from some of the other stuff that I was reading. I wanted something that I could literally just like sit down and read in a few hours, and this did that for me. So it was a nice break to the thrillers, the fantasy that I kind of finished out the month with. The last book I read this month was The Girls in the Garden by Lisa Jewell. This was my first Lisa Jewell book, and I guessed the ending. I'm just gonna say that. I was a little bored at the beginning, and then when it was like, again, in past time, it starts with the crime happening at the beginning, and then it jumps back, takes you to where it happened, and then from there on, it was very entertaining. I don't want to say entertaining. If you knew what happened in this book, you would not say entertaining. But it definitely kept my attention a lot more once we got into the present time. But I did guess the ending. I guessed pretty much what happened. I think you maybe are supposed to. There is a lot of triggering content in this book. I would read trigger warnings before you go into it. Overall, this is just about this woman, Claire, and her daughters, Pip and Grace, who move into this, I don't know what to call it, but it's this thing in London. They kind of explain it here. They move into this apartment that has this big garden and stuff, and park in the middle of it, and it's like in the center of a bunch of apartments and flats and stuff. So it's about them moving there because of circumstances that happened with their husband/father, and them trying to get through that tragedy, and they're making friends with the other girls and boys their age in that area, and there's been mysterious things that have happened in this garden over time, and a lot of the people that lived there have lived there for a long time, or are like second generation, third generation that lived there. So there's a lot to uncover with everyone's history, and I think at one point in the book they make it very clear what the ending's gonna be, but I think it's more just the dynamics of what a neighborhood or like a community like that can do, and what they can hide for each other based on their pasts together. That's more what I took out of it than actually figuring out what happened. It was enjoyable. I think there's other books that she's read that I've heard better things about that I might enjoy more, but it has not put me off of reading another one of her books. It just wasn't the most phenomenal thriller that I've ever read. So that is it for my January wrap-up. I will try to edit this down to be as brief as possible. I don't want this to be super duper long, and I will probably follow a very similar format for the rest of the year unless I decide to change something based on feedback. I have a very exciting TBR for February. You can go watch the TBR Jar Picks My TBR for the next month, and I'll see you at the end of February for the wrap-up of those. Hopefully I read them all as well. I'm looking forward to maybe having a few more 5-star or close to 5-star reads next month based on the books that I have planned to read. So stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching if you've made it this far, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!